What's up, guys? Time to review another 80s deep cut slasher, and I'm going to take credit for this one. I kind of stumbled upon this myself. So let's review The Dorm That Dripped Blood. The Dorm That Dripped Blood stars Lori Lipinski, Steven Sachs, Daphne Zuniga, and is directed by Stephen Carpenter and Jeff Obrow. What's up, guys? Welcome to another classic slasher review. And I will say, the title of this movie, The Dorm That Dripped Blood, at face value, I thought this must be a Giallo film because the title screams Giallo. You know how Giallo titles, there's at least 4 words, if not more, in each title. And there's always something strange about it. It's not really strange, it's The Dorm That Dripped Blood, but when you watch the movie, you can tell that this is an American film, or you might assume that it's Canadian, but my research tells me that this is an American film. It was actually filmed by 2 film school students while they were in film school in Los Angeles. They actually did this movie on weekends. So I found this story inspiring. Not the movie itself, even though the movie is interesting, but just the story behind it, about, just film school students. And they were, I guess, they had an idea for a slasher movie, and they thought, hey, let's just film it on weekends. And that's what they did. And before I jump into this, I will say I'm going to talk about I guess there's a twist in this movie, and I want to discuss it. I will give you a warning when we get to that portion. It'll be like in the, I guess, the final act of the review. But don't worry, I will give you a warning because we're going to talk about some spoilers type stuff in that section. But first off, let's give you a quick plot synopsis. The Dorm That Dripped Blood is about this dormitory and this group of college students during the Christmas break. They are going to renovate it because I guess the dormitory is being torn down. They're going to be moved to a different location. So they're all staying behind to do that. And the first observation about this movie is that it is, I guess, considered a Christmas slasher, even though you would never guess it except for maybe a couple of scenes where you see some Christmas lights. But as far as Christmas slashers go, in terms of just having that Christmas atmosphere, this would definitely be my least on the list. All right, this does not feel like a Christmas slasher at all. But while they're all staying behind doing this renovation, there is this killer going around, and he's just picking them off one by one in classic slasher fashion. That's it. That's the nuts and bolts of this story. Now, there is a motive, sort of, kind of given in the movie. And we'll get to that once we get into the spoiler section. But first off, how I kind of stumbled upon this movie, the cover art kind of caught my eye, if you can make that out there. It does look like a Giallo type of movie. And at the time when I bought this, which was a couple years ago, I was really heavy into my Giallo phase. I guess I'm still heavy into my Giallo phase. But The Dorm That Dripped Blood sounded like a really cool title. But then I come to find out that Daphne Zuniga, who was also in The Initiation, which I think around that time I had just reviewed The Initiation. And I'm aware of Daphne Zuniga. She was in Spaceballs. She was in like Melrose Place. I've known about her for quite a few years, decades even. But, I thought, hey, she usually picks pretty interesting stuff, especially earlier in her career. The Initiation is one of the most underrated slashers I've ever seen. So I had to give this a try. And I will say, this is Daphne's first movie, all right? So know that going into this, and how far she lasts in this movie may not be that long, just because you know that this is her first movie. She is not the final girl of this movie. The final girl is a character named Joanne, who is the main character of this movie. She is kind of overseeing this whole renovation. She's in charge of all these other students, and she's really the first one that starts noticing all these weird things going on. Even though at the time she notices them, she doesn't know that there's killings going on. But there's this strange character named Hemet that pokes his head up, and so automatically we start getting suspicions about this guy. And this is like the middle of the night when a strange guy that we don't know is roaming around just peeking through windows, and he doesn't seem all there. Of course, these young people, they're going to be on edge. Now, like I said earlier, I found the story behind this movie pretty inspiring because, this is 1982. If you remember, Friday the 13th had just come out in 1980. And Stephen Carpenter and Jeff Obrau were inspired by that movie. And we always give credit to Halloween, but you got to give major credit to Friday the 13th for really kicking the doors open in terms of just being graphic and bloody, thanks to Tom Savini. And horror at the time was a great way to get your foot in the door because a lot of people went to horror movies, and also it's cheap to make these movies. And you can tell by watching this movie, it's very low budget in feel. That is part of the problem of the movie because, thinking back, the original Halloween only cost $320,000 to make. But that movie looks like a $10 million movie. This movie, I don't know what the budget of this movie was. It couldn't have been that much, but it goes the other direction because you can tell that this is pretty much a glorified student film. Even some of the cuts don't feel that professional. But overall, the movie flows quite well, and it does get better and better as it goes along. So in terms of storytelling, I think it's very successful. I just think in terms of filmmaking, not the best. Also, this movie does have quite a few kills. Some of them are interesting. Some of them not so much. I mentioned earlier about, the opening kill. But, there's a great amount of time before the kills start picking up again. One of the kills that this movie got in a lot of trouble for, and they wanted to give it an X rating, was the drill kill. The killer, he drills into the back of the janitor's head. And, that kill was one of the instances where the MPAA came in and they just butchered this movie. And it's interesting to me that they butchered this movie pretty much in the early 80s, where slasher movies were getting away with a lot more back then. I mean, hell, the first Friday the 13th had some pretty bloody stuff in it. But this movie, the MPAA, they weren't having it. And it was even on like the video nasties list for an amount of time. But I do think the kills that are less about blood and just more about style are the more interesting ones. Like the scene where one of the characters gets, she's boiled alive. And I do love the scene where Joanne, she's in the room, Himmett's on the other side, and when she turns around, boom, there's Brian, and his body is just completely hacked up. Now, cutting to the chase, no pun intended, the final act of this movie is, to me, the best part of the movie, as it should be, but it's got a lot going for it, not just because it's the final act, but this is where the plot really kind of reveals itself, and the twists and all that stuff. But unfortunately for you guys that haven't seen this movie, this is where a lot of the spoiler stuff starts happening too. But I'll say that up front before I get to all that stuff. I love how this movie really kept you on your toes, and I'd say it's a patient movie because it's opened up with this really fun kill where these parents are picking up this one student, and you are, it's front loaded with a couple of good kills there. One being the student, her head is rolled over. But then it spends a long time, and some might say to its detriment, kind of setting up who is this Hemmett character, and really just leaning more on the tension. And I guess that's where my cons for this movie are, is I guess the first half of the movie. I do like Joanne as a character, and luckily she is the final girl of the movie, but I think the rest of the characters around her, they're not quite as interesting. Even Daphne Zuniga doesn't get that much to play with in this movie. She's far better in The Initiation. And her acting's fine, but like I said, her part isn't that big in this. Also, I was complaining about the Christmas atmosphere. Well, just atmosphere in general. This movie does feel quite bland setting-wise. A big part of the problem is just it takes place in a dormitory, and we're, concrete walls, concrete stairwells. There's just very little character in terms of like the cinematography. It feels very dark and black, and there's just not much character in the background of these characters. To give you a good example, there's one scene where they're having this dinner, and you see the dinner on the table, but behind the dinner, there's no lighting. Everything is just black. And who would have a dinner around a setting like that? If you're dressing a set, you have to have lighting strategically placed throughout, just to give the scene some character. And I think that's part of the struggle of watching this movie it's just not that interesting to look at. And you know what, if I have to give some credit to the newer horror movies, they have that part, I think, nailed down, in terms of just making a scene look interesting. They do a much better job these days than they did with a lot of these 80s classic slashers. I think that's why Friday the 13th works so well too, is because most of the movie is filmed outside. And you have that beautiful camp scenery, even in the nighttime. And with this movie, like I said, most of it just takes place in a dormitory setting in low lighting. Now, our main character, Joanne, I think a lot of guys are pretty smitten with her throughout this movie. There's this character at the beginning, her boyfriend, and he's really kind of pushing her, pressuring her to move in with him. And she's like, she's not ready for that. Then there is this other character named Bobby Lee. He's just this local guy, and he buys and sells parts that she's selling. But you can tell immediately that he's kind of smitten with her, and he ties into the story later. And then there's another character in this movie that seems pretty smitten with her too. But I like the way that they utilize Joanne in this movie, especially in the final act. So speaking of the final act, this is the portion where I want to talk about stuff that concerns spoilers. If you don't want to know what happens, then you might not want to watch this section of the review. And I will say I watched this movie twice because it is a whodunit. When you watch whodunits, the second viewing's often different than the first viewing because then you're looking at it through a new lens, right? You know who the killer is, so then you're paying attention to how the killer is reacting. So I guess starting off with this Hemet character who is very eccentric, and you can tell, why they used this character like they did. He's a little off. He might even be mentally challenged. But there's a section in the movie during the big chase. When I first watched the movie, I felt like he was the killer. I thought this was just a straight up slasher movie that you don't see the killer's face for the longest time, and then eventually it's revealed, oh, okay, it's this Hemet guy. But something's different because he's at the door and Joanne's on the other side of it, and he's telling her,
open the door. You've got to trust me. I came here to find you.
But you can tell by the look on his face that he's 2 Millers short of a six-pack. Something's off there. And so we don't trust the guy. And of course, Joanne doesn't trust the guy. So really, he's our red herring. And eventually, in what is one of the longest final acts I've ever seen in a movie, it's revealed that Craig is the killer. And I think they do a good job with the misdirection here because I didn't call that at all.
It's been me the whole time. I'm the one.
And Craig, you guessed it, is smitten with Joanne. So his motive is kind of weak. I mean, he goes through all this, killing all these people, and he's, for Joanne. Don't get me wrong, Joanne's a very lovely looking lady. But this guy, he was friends with Joanne and all these other people, and he seemed like he was stable. But then he just, loses it at the end. But then Bobby Lee factors into the movie later because, luckily he shows up to save the day, and he gets into this big fight with Craig. But then Craig, he tricks the cops that show up. And so they end up shooting Bobby Lee. So Craig not only blames one guy, Hemet, but he also blames Bobby Lee, which makes this movie kind of unique. And then to make it even more unique, Joanne is a very likable final girl. I really, enjoyed her. I didn't think she was through the roof or anything, but I think she was a rootable character. So then, to my surprise, he freaking just throws her into an incinerator and kills her. So this is one of those few slasher movies where the final girl gets killed at the end. There's a couple others. I don't even know if I could make a top 10 list of final girls that didn't make it. Craig gets away with the whole thing, which was kind of interesting. So overall, guys, I quite enjoyed The Dorm That Dripped Blood, also known as Pranks, also known as Death Dorm. But, I think it's just your straight up run-of-the-mill slasher. And if it wasn't for the great final act, then I don't think it would be as memorable as I think it is. So I'm gonna give it a pretty much a straight up humdrum. Thank God for the riveting final act and all those twists. I think that's what really bumps the movie up a notch or two. So I'll put a link to the Synopsis Blu-ray down in the comments, so you guys can go and buy it. Let me know what you guys think of the dorm that dripped blood when you watch it. Also, be sure to come over to Killer Flicks, where we talk horror all day and every day. And on Fridays, we do Free For All Fridays. Follow me at Drumdums on all my socials, support me on Patreon, buy me a coffee. And you guys, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day. Drumdum out.